7:06, one of the first people I thought about and hoped to get back on the show Saturday morning was our guest, Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Research and Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute, who joins us now. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning. Nice to be with you, my friend.
Nice to talk to you, and thank you for the work you do at Brookings every day. What are we dealing with here? Is it as bad as it appears to be? Should we all take a breath and allow things to settle? Where are you on this?
Yeah, it's pretty bad, Steve. I mean, Israel is now planning on this siege operation, which, of course, is a word that harkens back to Middle Ages warfare, right, if not the World Wars. And I don't think that Israel means it quite that way, but they certainly want to convey a very stark sense of what they're planning. And I think they are intending to do as much damage to Hamas as they possibly can, including the possible elimination of its assets and maybe even as much of its leadership as they can. You know, they've been living in this sort of state of live and let live, so to speak, with Hamas, but obviously and literally that's no longer viable after the attacks, the terrible tragedy of Saturday. And, directed at civilians, innocent people, young people. I mean, it's just unspeakable. And so I think Israel has decided, or at least intuitively and emotionally very much decided, and perhaps intellectually as well, to eliminate Hamas. However, that may be hard to do. And we'll see how long they are able to maintain a very tough operation inside of Gaza before their own public, but even more international opinion, forces them to curtail those operations and allow more humanitarian relief and more of a resumption of normal life. We'll see if they can really get rid of Hamas. And by the way, what about those hostages? Are they going to be able to eliminate Hamas without having those hostages executed one by one? So I don't dismiss the possibility of some kind of a deal whereby, in the end, Hamas is allowed to remain with some degree of influence and the hostages are released. But it's too soon to know. That's the kind of endgame discussion you could imagine in this situation. But otherwise, Israel could be left with Gaza again to run on its own. And are they going to want the UN to take over with a trusteeship? What's going to be the approach at that point? Nobody really even knows. I don't think Israel even knows.
Well, and the biblical nature of this, regardless of your spirituality, is this circle of death. And I don't, want to make this more grim than it is, but if you take out Hamas, you're going to take out, and I'm not arguing that they shouldn't, but you're going to take out thousands of innocent civilians, innocent by nature of where they live, in the process. It's impossible not to because of the nature of what you'd have to do. This is not a tactical strike, right?
Right. But I'm afraid that as much as I think Israel will try to use care in how it applies force, it won't find the argument that you made very compelling, because, of course, what they'll say is leave aside eye for an eye, tooth for understandable desire for a certain amount of vengeance at this point, and the fact that therefore they're willing to wind up inadvertently harming someone who wasn't involved in the attacks. They need to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. And the fact that they lost 1,000 or so people, was only because they did react more slowly than they should have, but faster than they might have. And they could have lost thousands themselves. So the argument, I realize you're putting it out there just as something for us all to remember, but the argument that several thousand Palestinian innocent casualties could deter them from conducting an operation they consider essential now for their own security, I don't think they will find compelling. And moreover, I think they'll be able to limit innocent casualties to hopefully less than that. We'll see, and time will tell.
What is the nature of the region in that the hatred, the irrational hatred of the Jews is baked into a point? Does this start a new fire in the Arab community to eliminate, to erase Jews from the planet and all the horrible things that have been said in the past? Or is that so baked in that even a massive wipeout of Hamas wouldn't make it worse?
Well, you're right to conjure up the worst case, because one has to contemplate that, and I'm sure many Israelis are. But I don't think that we're there anymore. I certainly hope and pray not. I mean, three major Arab countries have made peace with Israel. Doesn't mean they necessarily like the idea of Israel, but I think they've moved beyond this sense of wanting to exterminate the state altogether or the Jews that live within it. And the Saudis, of course, have been on the threshold of a new deal with Israel, which may have been part of the catalyst for Hamas acting now to make sure that deal didn't happen. But it still already reflects a more businesslike and more realistic attitude. Again, there may not be a lot of warmth between Israel and its neighbors, but there's a certain practicality to their relationships that has developed over the years, and that I think precludes the worst case that you just mentioned. But Israel's certainly going to always have its own back first and foremost, make sure it watches for its own security and not let its guard down just because it hopes we move beyond that kind of anti-Jewish hatred.
Michael, very broad question, how should the rest of the world be responding? I know the U.S., of course, sending ships and weapons and aid support. Russia now saying that they're taking this wait-and-see approach. They're stepping back for now. But how about the other factions like the Saudis that you were talking about, Syria, Hezbollah?
Well, I think the Saudis seem to be putting everything on hold, more or less. And, obviously, like other governments, they've made their own pitches and pleas for restraint without naming names about, who caused this. And that's my understanding of the latest Saudi position. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I haven't tracked each and every major state's reaction, but that's sort of been the thrust of what most Arab countries have done with this situation. Only a couple, like I think Qatar, have said it's Israel's fault. And in any event, I think that beyond this question of what public posture you take rhetorically, we're going to have to start thinking about the end game. And I think that a number of Arab countries, especially ones that have peace agreements already with Israel, may wind up being asked to provide troops for a trusteeship. And that's an idea that I admit I haven't heard a lot of other people say it. I'm saying it because I think it needs to be in the conversation.
Right.
And something like that, I think, is going to be required because I don't see Hamas being allowed to keep ruling Gaza, and I don't think the Israelis are willing to or want to themselves. So that leaves, what can you do? You could have some kind of a coalition government of other Palestinians with a UN peacekeeping force or a UN monitoring force, or you could have the UN actually for a couple of years. And that's what I mean by trusteeship. And, the kind of thing we've sometimes used with Haiti. It obviously doesn't always work, as we can see from Haiti. But those are the kind of ideas I think that people should start kicking around and thinking as to whether they would help support them.
How do we end up getting involved beyond the involvement we already have? And is Iran stupid enough to amp this up and be public about their involvement?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right to raise that specter, too. And we obviously have sort of symbolically raised it by sending an aircraft carrier into the Eastern Mediterranean. And on the one hand, that's sort of the American instinct. We've got all these carriers. 2 or 3 of them are usually forward deployed at any given time anyway. If you've got a crisis, why not send the carrier close by? It sends a message of American interest. But the danger of that kind of movement is that then it leaves you in a situation where you sort of imply the United States would use power if we felt we needed to. And if we felt, Hezbollah attacked Israel, for example, is that really a war we want to enter into? The last time we got involved in Lebanon with direct U.S. military force was really, in any substantial way, was 1983, when, of course, we wound up with 241 dead Marines in the barracks bombing, a tragedy that still haunts the Marine Corps to this day. And that was because we thought we could use a little bit of force, put a couple of battleships near the shore, send a message. This kind of thinking can be a little bit sloppy and can lead you down a slippery slope. So I don't know exactly what we think we would do with that aircraft carrier, as well as the tactical fighter squadrons of the Air Force that we're sending. I assume the idea is to say that Hezbollah, if you attack Israel from the north with large bore rocketry or artillery, we could strike those systems with air power. And, again, that may be a message worth sending, but I just want to voice a note of caution. In previous conflicts, Israel's taken on Hezbollah by itself. I'm not really sure we want to be part of that war, even if it happens.
It's Michael O'Hanlon. Let me get a 30-second traffic update in here and come back. I want to ask you, for 5 days, as a coordinated attack and as organized as this attack was and horrific as it is, why and what is the goal? What do they fully believe they can get out of this? They being Hamas. Stand by for that. First, this talking to Michael O'Hanlon at the Brookings Institute. Michael, there's meetings that take place. There's plans that take place. We know Al Qaeda took years, and the overall goal seemed to be to create disarray and a coming apart of America. And you could argue all day how much success that has had in the last 20 years. What is Hamas thinking here? What is their goal?
It's a good question. It's obviously a terrible decision on so many levels, including that I think they're going to regret it. And I assume what they're thinking is, first of all, we've been frustrated in this semi-blockade Israel's imposed for 16 years. And we don't see any movement on the peace process front, although it's not clear Hamas ever wanted a peace process. Of course, they have remained committed to Israel's destruction, which is one of the reasons I have so little sympathy for them. But I think they might have maybe expected their attack not to be quite as effective. Some people have said they probably wanted to kill no more than a few dozen people, maybe primarily Israeli troops, take a few hostages, get some international attention, some relief of the plight of their fellow Palestinians in Gaza, trade for some hostages of their own that Israel holds, or prisoners, I should say, and maybe not have provoked such a strong Israeli reaction by an operation that tactically sort of got beyond their aspirations and beyond their control. That's one theory that's out there. And in other words, they're not going to like what they wound up or what they're going to wind up with, but it wasn't really on purpose. They almost exceeded expectations, sort of like, again, with 9/11. People are often saying this is Israel's 9/11, and Al-Qaeda sort of overachieved on 9/11. And that's one theory. Another theory is that Hamas is so overconfident in its ability to survive the Israeli retaliation that it felt that the worst Israel would do would be, a longer period of airstrikes and very limited ground incursions, which, are sort of like what happened in the past, like in 2014. And maybe Israel does 2014 times 2, but nothing of a nature that would lead to Hamas's overthrow or destruction. And maybe they're still going to be right. Who knows at what point Israel does call back its forces, decide it's done enough, and just build a better fence and hope for better results next time. I don't know, but I'm perplexed myself.
Michael, kind of a part 2 to what Steve was talking about. With regard to the hostages, what is the reality, or what are even the chances at this point that any of these hostages can be saved, come back home safely? I mean, best case scenario, peace talks will begin. But going back to what you both have been saying, I don't know if Hamas is able to be negotiated with. So what's the reality of the hostages coming home?
Well, I think there's a possibility. I don't know how to assess likelihood, so I'm glad you didn't ask that.
Yeah.
But Hamas has negotiated before, and it's taken prisoners and traded with Israel for the mutual release of those prisoners. And so maybe that's what, the goal here is again this time. And maybe that'll be the reality this time. I'm not sure Israel is going to be interested in that negotiation. And so it's possible that Israel will feel like there's not much it can do about those hostages because it's already lost well over 1,000 people. It could lose another 1,000 or 5,000 in a future attack if Hamas is not eliminated now. And therefore, the lives of 100 plus hostages cannot be prioritized. That's one way Israel might think about it. More likely is that Israel will say they're not willing to negotiate. And for the first few days, they won't be. But then at some point, let's say, I don't know how to predict time horizons, but maybe next week, we wind up at a point in the whole operation where people reassess what their priorities are. And maybe then, at least quietly, there is the beginning of a negotiation. That's one possibility.
Last word on this, for now at least. Does Hamas listen to anybody else in the Arab world and anybody that would have influence to try to direct them to not make this even worse than it already is?
Yes, they do depend on funding from a number of other
and not just Iran, right?
Not just Iran, Qatar, for example. I don't remember who else funds Hamas and who funds the Palestinians. A lot of folks try to help fund the Palestinian population in Gaza, and collectively, there's a lot of leverage there, in theory, at least. And so, yes, I would think that it's a distinct possibility that there will be some quiet counsel, and probably people like King Abdullah of Jordan are very busy this week trying to think of what role they could play in defusing this before innocent Palestinians suffer any more than they have to come back to a point, Steve, that you began with. So, I think there are probably going to be a lot of those conversations happening. to the extent that Hamas still has communications with the outside world. I assume they do. I think they probably have backup electricity and things like that. But I don't know about those conversations seem to be very quiet right now, but I think you're right. They're probably happening.
Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Research and Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Read everything he writes and listen to him here and everywhere he speaks. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you, my friends.
There you go. It's just so disturbing.
Oh, it's completely disturbing.
It feels like a car without brakes and you're going to run into a wall. I mean, I just would like to see some light at the end of the tunnel. It's hard to imagine how this ends. And I hope, man, do I hope I'm wrong. But it feels like it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Oh, completely. Completely.
Yeah.
The worst thing is just the humanist, all the images that we are seeing that, in an unprovoked attack against families. This wasn't just, two factions fighting against each other or, the governments, the soldiers. They're just an unprovoked.
You start killing kids and babies, you don't have an argument.
Right. People watching television. And, we talked about the story yesterday with the woman, the man and the husband and the wife.
Right.
And they invaded the home and she cooked for them to kind of
she talked to them long enough
for their lives.
The security people to get there.
Right. So ABC News went into the home, and honest to God, John, you couldn't even see the wall. It was riddled with bullets. It's a miracle that they're alive.
They're just living a complete and total nightmare.
Yeah.
So if you're inclined, and I hope you are, say your prayers.